we are here to celebrate this event that has been organized by FAMA with the support of Florida Humanities. And it's this some talk. We will have the company of the two renowned scholars, Damian and Shery Burian. I will share with you my screen so we can begin our presentation. So the name of our talk is Circularity of Textile Time, and we will explore the relationship between pre-Hispanic textiles and modern fiber art as a way of rewriting Latin American art history, thinking on the living presence of this powerful inheritance. We will begin the first part. It's like a trip to the past, but not only the past, but it's the living presence. And that's why we select the name of the Circularity of Textile Time, because the pre-Hispanic inheritance is still alive. So it is my pleasure to present you Dr. Shery Burian. She will talk about ancient to modern Andes. You can see how Shery Burian started at the George Washington Museum's Lisa and Bernard Cells curator in 2021. And she co-created the exhibition Threads of Time, Tradition, and Change in Indigenous American Textiles. So I will let you with her.
All right, so thank you, Adriana, for putting together this wonderful panel and this great opportunity to talk about the past and the present coming together. So for my part of the presentation, what I'm going to do is do two things. One is I'm going to present one of the most basic structures of textile making in the Andes, which is the foundation for everything that follows. It's very old. And I'm also going to talk about a set of different iconographies that also appear very early and are some that have been traced down to work that's being done in contemporary highlands communities in certain regions. So that's sort of how this is going to flow. Ancient Andean societies selected object-centered and tangible ways of communicating, and recording is how they express their relationship to each other, to their environment. They express different spiritual concepts, and weaving played a really central role in this. And testament is how early it started. So the very first fragments of textiles were in the Andes were found in Peru in a place called Guitarrero Cave, which is in the Yungay province. And these excavated textiles were dated to 11,000 BCE. So that's how far back this goes. And they also started to develop different advanced technologies very early. The first use of a very special dye called indigo, which is what is used globally for blue. Currently, the earliest dated uses of that are also from Peru, from the site of Huaca Prieta in the Chicama Valley, and those date to 6,200 years ago. So we have a very long tradition. And one of the central parts of this, and I'm focusing on it because it's not only structurally fundamental, it's also fundamental in a communication and an expression sense. And this is the concept of what's called for-selvage weaving. So pretty much all of the cloth that's produced commercially, that we wear in clothes, that we see and touch every day, is produced in a weaving technique that's called to-selvage. And what a selvage is it's a part of the fabric that's completely closed. So say if you go into a fabric store and you get a bolt of yardage, they cut it off for you, there's two sides that are nice. There's no frayed edges or anything like that. And they've cut on the other ends. So that's what two selvages are. I don't know if I can point. I don't think I get that ability. That's okay.
The card, the heading card. I'm sorry.
Oh no, yeah, back to the previous slide. Sorry. Well, I'll just do it vocally. Perfect. In the Andes, what they did was something called forest selvage, which is very complicated because what they wanted was a completely enclosed web of cloth that did not ever need to be cut to take it off the loom or to do much else with it, because what they believed was that cloth is alive, that the process of weaving a cloth, setting up the loom, putting all the threads in is the same as giving birth and raising a person. And so when the cloth is finished, you have a fully grown animate being. You don't then cut somebody's arms and legs off to call them finished. And that's what they viewed cutting into the web of cloth as. So what they did is, instead of putting the because cloth is composed of two different components. You have a horizontal thread and you have a vertical thread, and these interlock, and they can interlock in about 2,000 different ways, but that's what you need to get started. And what they did was, in order to make sure that they never had to cut any ends to take it off, you never were going to get those frayed edges, was they would use something called a heading cord. And this is a loom from what's called the Middle Horizon period, which is approximately 7th to 11th century AD. And this is in the Textile Museum's Coatson Center collection. So it's a great little piece. And a heading cord, which you can see with blue arrow, is a thick piece of thread that you tie to a bar of whatever type of loom you're using. You can do it with a backstrap loom, which I'll talk about in the modern context, which is just the bars that are held together by different threads. You could use it on a frame loom, so like a tapestry loom, if any of you are textile producers, or just 4 bars tied together. But instead of doing what you would usually do, which is wrap the threads around the bars, you wrap it around the cord. You tie the cord to the bar. When you're done, you pull the cord out and everything pops off. And that sounds really simple, but it's really, really hard because it requires a lot of force pulling in different directions, and all the tension and everything has to be right, which is another expression of an Andean concept called Aini in Quechua, which is the idea of two things that come together in order for something to function. And that's fundamental to society. And it's fundamental to society today, which, if you can go to the next slide.
Can you write the word for the chat of the Quechua word for this beautiful meaning? And Alina will send it to everyone.
Yes, that's Quechua. There will be some Aymara words later, and I'll identify the language. This is a modern loom that's in the Textile Museum collection that I'm actually going to put in an exhibition in a few years. It's from Puno and around the Lake Titicaca region on Chaquil Island. And it's a little difficult to see, but if you look at the bottom stick, the bar, you can make out just a thick sort of lump of thread that's right underneath the flower design. And all of this striped cord, that's exactly the same setup as you saw on the loom from the 7th century. This is exactly the same technique. And this is exactly the same type of loom. It's called a backstrap loom. And the reason it's called a backstrap loom is you have 2 bars that you put your vertical threads around, and you have one part you tie to something, tree, stake, something. I've seen people do it in a range of ways in Bolivia and Peru as well. And then you have a strap that goes around your back. And so all you have to do is lean back, stretch everything, get nice and tight, and then you start weaving. And then this can be picked up and wrapped up and brought with you to the fields, to your herding pastures, to any place that you can stake it out, which makes it very, very convenient. And you can do all types of techniques on this loom. The technique this one is set up for is called complementary warp. But this is a good example of how things have continued through time with that same emphasis on cloth as a living component. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So in thinking about iconography and thinking about the theme of this talk, one thing that really struck out at me, because it's something that the anthropologist Denise Arnold and the head of the Museo Nacional de Folklore y Etnografía in La Paz, Elvira Espejo, who is an Aymara master weaver, work they've done together in different IU groups within Bolivia is the importance of imagery that has to do with heads. So head-centric iconography. And this is very old. This is an amazing mantle that was made approximately between 250 BC to about 500 AD. So BC, we're talking very, very old. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some details of the iconography. And the things that jump out at you right away are these creatures with these enormous heads. And if you look closely, heads also start to pop up in different places, often accompanied by wavy lines, which is hair. Sometimes you have double heads, you have faces that mirror each other. And this imagery is important because the head was the center of visionary experience. It was a very powerful experience for shamans in different types of trances to see different types of heads, see reflections, things being inverted. And this imagery also carries over to ceramics and across cultures. So this is the Pracus culture. Go to the next slide. This is from the Nazca culture, which is a little bit later. And some of these have different smaller heads. And the most interesting one to me is the one in the bottom corner that comes from the Met. And this is someone who is in a visionary trance that has another head coming out of their mouth. So you have, this is the person, the principal figure, and then there's this another head that's being pulled out by the hair. And heads are often depicted as living, even though they're obviously separated from their body, but they're still seen as alive because it's such a center of life force. You can go to the next slide. And this idea of heads as life force, as centers of power, has gotten translated into modern textile iconography. It's very abstract at this point, and it's principally was used by the Cacachaca IU. That's what this specific example is from. That's where these anthropologists did their work, and then they found it had spread to other places when they started to look, is that these patterns are a skull with different eyes, which are, the eyes are Lyra, and the small skulls are Ulu. And I'll put those in the chat so people can see those words. And they perceive these as not only associated with physical heads and with spiritual power, but also with germination, because it turns out that these mantles were ones that were woven and worn during periods of ritual conflict between different IUs that happened at certain times of the year. But they happened at the times of the year right when the fields were fallow, everybody's getting ready for the new turning of the new soil, the turning of the new year. And so when they described the patterns, they talked about seeds, that the eyes were seeds, that seeds were coming out. And this is quickly just another example of how it then moves from these mantles and goes into these other forms, and it's hard to see, but they split them into half skulls. So on either side of that center is the same technique and the same counts, the same pickups that form that pattern. So this is one of my favorite examples of how an iconography can get carried on and changed from the past to the present.
Thank you, Shelley. This is really, really interesting. And we are traveling on time, so I will speak briefly about the modernity in European and North American textile, and how the art in both continents, but during the modernity, had ancestral indigenous roots. There is something that is very special, and I think that we are talking finally about these seeds of ancient American art. And these seeds were planted also within the imagination of the avant-garde in Europe. I think we need to rewrite Latin American art history, perhaps inverting the map precisely as Joaquin Torres Garcia suggests in his artwork, América Invertida. It's interesting that he played a fundamental role in Europe in the assimilation of Andean weaving through his work and his classes in universal constructivism. Actually, his son Augusto was a curator for the Louvre 1928 exhibition of ancient American art. And he was also a founding member of the Parisian artist group Cercle et Carré, Circle and Square, founded in 1929. And he spoke on pre-Columbian Andean art then. And other notable members of this group were Hans Arp and Kandinsky. So it is very interesting to think about how, while the avant-garde was discovering the abstraction in ancient America, abstraction had 1,000 of years. So they were really aware of the pre-Hispanic iconography, and I invite you to see and read the text that we have here. I have here one example of Sophie and Erika Taubert. You know that Sophie Taubert was an artist, painter, sculptor, dancer, and definitely one of the most important women artists in the geometric abstraction and constructivism. In this case, she appears in this documentary photo wearing Hopi Indian costumes, but she was also strongly influenced with the knowledge that the European have of pre-Hispanic iconography. Perhaps the thing is that the spiritual meanings were loose on the adaptation or on the appropriation that European artists did, even though they were, some of them were also looking for spirituality ways. Sophie influenced Lolo Soldevilla, but she was nourished by the textile art of the native peoples. In this photo, you know the Ukrainian artist Sonia Delaunay, and this is exactly the image of the simultaneous boutique for the International Exposition of Modern Industrial and Decorative Arts. An interesting fact is, of course, Sophie was married with Hans Arp, and all of them were together sharing knowledge. So you can see it, if you see in the back of the boutique, the iconography is entirely abstract and very much connected to the Andean inheritance. This is actually a code that Sonia Delaunay designed for Gloria Swanson in the same year of this exhibition in 1925. And you see, of course, we do have the Bauhaus, and that was and this dream of uniting the arts and craft and the design, the architecture, and of course the textile, with the important role of women. We see this photo is from 1929. So we see here a Kandinsky and well, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, etc., Walter Gropius, but particularly Kandinsky and Paul Klee, I'm sorry, that is wrongly written there, were part of this attraction for the ancient textiles. Gunther Stolz was the only woman in 1926 to be part of as one of the masters of the Bauhaus. But definitely the important thing is that the Precolumbian weavings that began to be studied in the early 20th century were more than a source of inspiration for the Bauhaus masters and other abstract artists in Europe and America. Gunther was a mentor for Joseph Albers, and then Annie Albers took the lead role between at the ends of the 20s and before the 1933, when the Bauhaus closed and they went to America. I think it's very interesting to see the trips, the dates of the trips that Annie and Joseph Albers did to Mexico and to the Andean region. In 1934, Clara Porcet, the now renowned designer, invited them to Mexico, and Joseph Albers wrote that Mexico is truly the promised land of abstract art, which has been here for thousands of years. Then, one decade later, in 1947, she began to work with her pictorial fabrics, and in the 50s she discovered and was absolutely fascinated in Peru and Chile with the textiles. This piece is inspired on Monte Alban, Mexico, but in her book published in 1965, Annie Albers dedicated on weaving to my great masters, the weavers of ancient Peru. And she posed one of the main dilemmas of fiber art. She said, a work of textile is considered a craft and not art. And as I always said, and I still say, when it's on paper, it's art. You can see here the open letter that she wrote after, that she weave after visiting Chile. That was a fundamental place for her formation, and you can see perfect here on her first exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1949. The influence of the pictogram. I mean, how she was really more than inspired by them. And we have also Sheila Hicks, that was Albers was a mentor of Hicks, and then also Sheila lived in and worked in Mexico and later in Chile. And she also go to study ancient Andean weaving in Chile, and that was a great source for her of creation. And this, I want to say how the living inheritance of what is the quipu and these systems of weaving or threads, information, transmitting information with knots. I think Carol will speak a little bit more on this, influenced contemporary artists as Jorge Eduardo Eyelson, one of the greatest artists that work with knots, excuse me, and quipus. And of course, we do have those works of Sheila. In this, you see here, when she was doing her master in Yale in 1957, she worked studying all this part she said she was trying to learn how ancient Andean textiles were made, trying to replicate them. This is what Sheila had said to Monique Levi-Strauss. And you can see the similarity between the Annie Albers necklace and the quipu. And we see how this quipu is still living and being activated for contemporary artists such as Cecilia Vicuña. And I do believe that there is something very important that is happening now, and is that the artists are trying to recover the spiritual and social charge of the pre-Columbian textiles. We do have many examples of the revival of the inheritance. And I said one part is following the quipu. We do have Olga de Amaral following the presence of the gold, the myth of El Dorado in her incredible tapestries, in the geometric abstraction in modern textiles that has passed sometimes to the mestizo population in places like Colombia. But this is an artist that since the 60s was working on this, and I think that there is a referential connection with the forms of the world and with the symbolic power of cultures in some of her textiles. At here, you see in the center, this piece by Estela Bernal de Parra is a type of Christ made with the current ruanas like this of the peasants in Colombia, but taking also certain techniques that goes back to the past. We do have cases as Miguel Aguirre that uses materials like the hair, but works with artisan like Elvia Paucar. And this is something that Carol will address about the relation between contemporary artists and this frontier between art and craft. Guido Llanito, for example, works with vicuña or materials like this, but he works more based on constructivism forms. And I think that feathers are part also of fiber art, as Cecilia Paredes' performance evoking the ceremonies and spiritual traditions of indigenous peoples, and doing her own dresses with feathers. And within the artists that are on display on the project held by FAMA, Threading the City, we do have Marta Alvarez. She did studies with people, Dembera people in Colombia, but she uses the painting for her embroideries. So we will have now the pleasure of speak with Carol Damian. And I think we will have time at the end for exchanging questions. Carol Damian is a professor of art history who taught for decades in the School of Art and Art History, and she's the former director and chief curator of the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum at FIU. She's a graduate of Walton College in Norton, Massachusetts, and she received her master in pre-Columbian art and her PhD in Latin American history from the University of Miami. A specialist in Latin American and Caribbean art, she teaches classes in pre-Columbian, Colonial, Spanish, and contemporary Latin American art, modern art surveys, and women in art. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you. So I am going to take many of the lessons that you've already heard about the indigenous peoples and the ancient crafts, and I'm going to try to bring them into the world today, especially focusing on the artists that are in the FAMA exhibitions. and looking at what I think are some of their influences and how they describe those influences. So can we just move on to the next slide? Okay, so for centuries, the indigenous have been mastering the art of weaving, embroidery, of textiles from place to place. I am showing you another image from Paracas. And Shelley, you might be interested to know that my field work is in Paracas for my master's. So I was very happy to see you putting up those beautiful images. And my master's work was in the oculate being, that big-headed guy with the big eyes. That was my research. So he's always in my presentations, you know, he sort of is living there in the back of my head. And so I was very happy to see you're referencing to him. But as Shelley explained with Paracas, this is an extraordinary complex type of weaving, embroidery, of just hard to even replicate, to think about how they did this so many hundreds of years ago. And many of the textiles have been beautifully preserved because they were buried in the desert where they didn't have any rain. And so the sand and the lime and the sand really did help to preserve them, because everybody asks, how did they get these colors to last all these years? Well, because they were protected in the sand. But it is an example of extraordinary craftsmanship from the Andes. And it is, for me, very influential, or I should say inspirational, not only in the Andes, but when you look back at other cultures like in Bolivia, Mexico, Guatemala, these artisans that are working today with their craft have been inspired by the past somewhere. And most of it is ritual. Just as Shelley explained, this is not just about making a pretty picture or even explaining a symbolic repertoire having to do with the ritual. This is the ritual. The making of the textiles is part of a ritual. Okay, Adriana, next. So, as I said, I'm going to kind of look at the traditions of the past and the present, looking at some of the art that is in the exhibit. The one on the right, Woman on Chair with Flowers, which is at Pinecrest, and is in a really, it's big and it's very, very, very impressive. And the minute that I saw it, I said, oh my gosh, this looks like an arpillera, which is a storytelling fabric that is made by the women of Lima, Peru today. I mean, this is something that they are doing today, and they're really quite masters at working this technique, which is a kind of embroidery, but it's also piecing together fabric and stitching them. And what they do is they're textile pictures. So just as the ancients used the textiles to tell stories and to give us pictures, the arpilleras do the same thing. They tell the stories of the lives of the women in these barrios that created them to maintain a history. It's kind of like the quilters in the South of America. Okay, can we go next?
Before, I want you to think for when you finish, it's a hard question, but what makes art art, and what makes artisans when you, because sometimes you can think how things that are created by peasants became a craft just because they're created by them. This is something I want you to address later.
Yes, that's the age-old question, and I'm sure that all the weavers that are, all 35 of you who are on this participating, all of you are interested in this question that we have been asking ourselves for a long, long time. Why isn't this art, right? Okay, so going back to Cecilia Vicuña and the quipu, and how she uses the quipu in her work. This amazing device, record-keeping device with the very intricate knotting that Adriana referred to before. And so I look at these artists that are doing these knots and referring back to the quipus, sometimes subtly. Maybe this is not exactly what they want to be doing, but certainly an artist like Cecilia, she calls these quipus. So we know that she's very influenced by the quipus and the history of the quipu, and to hear her speak about them in her exhibits when she's here for her exhibits. I mean, she knows the history so very well, and it's kind of like an obsession with her. So I think that we need to reference that and to pay homage to the quipu masters that did these records that are so complex, and there's all sorts of theories about exactly what they meant, but they never divulged their secrets to the Spanish. So it's only through scholars today that they are coming up with what the knots actually mean. And I mean, they're numerical, they have to do with ancestry. There are a lot of different things that they record through knots. Okay, next. So there are many of these techniques, processes, traditions, and stories that come about, and the artists in the exhibit throughout all the FAMA exhibits and throughout the city really provide us with a demonstration of so much. We can just go from place to place, artist to artist, and see the way they work. And I think it's particularly interesting when the artists are working with indigenous peoples and have gone to the workshops, have really tried to preserve these histories. I think that one of our local artists that I hope she's on this maybe, is Aurora Molina. And Aurora has, for the last few years, she has been in many, many locations. She just came back from Morocco, but she has been throughout Mexico. She's been in the Andes. She's been in Guatemala, and she works with the indigenous women to understand what they were doing and why they were doing it. And then what she does just wonderfully is she translates this message into her own work. So the work, while we see the influences, you know, you look and you say, oh, I see Toledo here, or I see this, or I see that. It's really Aurora's work, not only because of the information that she provides. And can we go to the next one? This magical gardens. This is from Oaxaca. This project that she did with Oaxaca, but it's also because of how she works, the kind of stitchery, embroidery, starting, of course, with the weaving. I mean, you know, these stitches and these stories are told on cloth that is woven by Aurora, but also in techniques and processes that here you can see her with the backstrap loom, that she learns from the indigenous artists and then takes as her own to bring it into her world, into our world. So it's really, she calls it the magical garden. And I think that that's such an appropriate title for so much of what she does with her work. Okay, next. We have another, next slide. So just to show you a couple of other, we can go back one, I think. I think there, yeah, right here. So this is again from the Magical Garden series, and this interest that that she has in using embroidery and using stitchery to tell stories. And on the right, I think it's a really wonderful example, a kind of a segue from what Shery and Adriana were talking about, and that is the geometric imaging that you see here, the abstraction that is very much part of indigenous cultures. It was not invented by 20th century artists who decided geometric abstraction was a good way to go. It had been around for a long time. So this geometric cosmogonies is another example of how this artist is using the past to inform the present. Next. One of the very interesting projects that she did with the children in Oaxaca, also conducting workshops with the children, is a portrait project where she taught the children to create a series of portraits of themselves or perhaps of somebody in their family, and working with amazing stitches. I mean, these are kids that grew up kind of surrounded by the crafts of Oaxaca, which, as everybody knows, is one of the most extraordinary of cities for crafts of all kinds, and it really taking their energy and leading them to use that craft, to use that stitchery for this series of portraits, and also to be proud. I mean, a lot of this has to do with pride, to be proud of your heritage and to be proud of the craft that your mothers and your grandmothers and your great grandmothers practiced for many generations, and to not let it, to preserve it, not to let it be forgotten. So it's kind of a celebration and a preservation. Okay, next. So this is information about that. We can go on, so you don't want to read all that, but it's basically that. This is another very interesting idea, also inspired by Mesoamerica and mythology, the Nahual. And they are, so she does a series of masks inspired by this concept, this ritual again, and the stories, the legends that refer to any person with the power to transform him or herself into an animal, usually a jaguar, a puma, or a wolf. So these are kind of like the legendary tales that every child hears, every place in the world. You know, you better go to sleep, or this creature is going to come and haunt you in the middle of the night. So it's it could be benevolent, it could be malevolent, but it's a series of works that take that idea and give it form in a very contemporary way, but again, inspired by the past. Next. So I want to look at, now we're sort of in Mexico. I want to look at the work of Laura Villarreal from Mexico, and what she does, and also from Oaxaca, is she does fiber interventions on a very important book that has to do with classical texts for the niños of this particular area. Jose Vasconcelos, who wrote the book in 1924, was the director of the School of Education in Mexico City, and he was the one who invited Diego Rivera and his crew to do the mural. So he's a very important personality in Mexico and an educator. So it's interesting because we know now, as we look at these, that there's a lot of underlying messaging going on here as well, with these interventions that, you know, we don't have to get into the colonialism here, but it is interesting how she has taken weaving and these geometric designs and imposed them onto the pages of this particular book. So she too is bringing a 100-year-old book into the present with her interventions and asking you to look carefully at the book and to understand what history is all about. Next.
And she, excuse me for the interruption, she did it with Rigo Mendoza, an artisan from Oaxaca. So
From Oaxaca,
starting
yes.
Oaxaca embroidery legacy into this thought of Occidental culture.
Yes, and that's that to me is what's been very interesting, especially about putting together this talk and looking at the artists and their interventions and the expressions that they use that are so inspirational from the past. So this is Isabel Infante, and she's from Chile. So we're back in the Andes now again, and with a very, very rich history of textiles, the Andean peoples, and how she is using sisal, which is an important product as well throughout the Americas. And it has meaning as a functional utilitarian material, but here she is weaving it into cotton and into designs and into objects that take it out of that dimension of the utilitarian into something that is to be viewed and appreciated as an aesthetic and as a high level. This is art, you know, so going back to that comment about art again. Okay, next. So on the left top is an example of a loincloth that is made of these individually warped strands of vicuña, where you could see this sort of the same idea of the threads, the raw threads that she uses as inspiration, and also some of the other textiles that come from Chile, from the ancient world from the Mapuche, who are very much present today, but and their traditions as well. Next.
I think this is the last.
Yeah, this was the last, because this, you know, leads us back into this idea that Adriana addressed about geometric abstraction and its origins.
And it is now we will share briefly, but it's very important because we do have a part of Threading the City, an exhibition dedicated to Mayan contemporary artists. And I would comment with Cheryl and Carol regarding this work of basically we do have Antonio Pichilla, Cuacain. It's not he likes the Kiacain, his second last name to be spelled. So excuse me because I didn't did in the first part. And it was this beautiful piece was inspired by one of the libros pintados, the painted books, the codices found in Mesoamerica. So I want Shelley to let us know if she has any comment on these particular works of Pichilla and what he's doing, or your vision as an expert on pre-Columbian art.
Well, I'm not necessarily an expert in this particular area, but as I was looking at some of these images before, what really sticks out at me when I look at them is how much they rely on weaving techniques. And actually what he's wrapped in the center one here, that is sort of a version of a warping board. So when you're setting out your vertical threads, which are called a warp, for different types of looms, and in Guatemalan communities, Mayan communities, they use different types of looms. They integrated a little bit more some of the European treadle style looms, which is what most people think about in the US. We think about a loom with the backstrap, traditional backstrap, but sometimes you'll use these wooden boards with these stakes that are driven into them to get the order correct so that you don't have a problem with your pattern once you start. And then in the other ones, especially this one, the image to the right,
this one
is yes, that one.
I mean this one that you have, no, the other one. Oh
yeah, they kind of both draw on this idea, which is the dye technique that indigenous Mayan communities today are the most known for in terms of dyeing, which is called haspe. some of you might be more familiar with the Indonesian term of ikat dyeing, but this form of resist dyeing where you take the threads and you bind them or knot them in some way into groups, and then you dye them, and then you take the wraps and the knots out, and you have these white portions. So yeah, I think it's we can see
this one.
this one.
You're referring
Yes,
to this one. Yes, you're referring to
Yes.
this one, which is a specific technique of dyeing that is fabulous. And it's interesting because what I see is that they are taking inspiration on the past of their culture, but they are also very entirely aware because the three of them study art. So they can use all the knowledge of a European and modern and contemporary art, but they at the same time, they are deeply rooted. And I think particularly Antonio Pichillacain, the titles of those pieces are Abuela, and he has one that is Abuelo, that actually it's inspired. And the white one, the white fabric is the type of clothes that the man uses in Atitlan, in the Atitlan Lake. So he took this pattern that is used for wearing pants for the men, and then he dyed with the collaboration of women, artisans, and this other type of colors. That something very much interesting is that he is not talking. We tend to think that primary colors are about Mondrian and constructivismo or neoplasticismo. No, he is using these colors because these colors are for the colors of the stages of corn, the corn. Also the directions of the cardinal points. So he is transforming a wearable piece into contemporary art.
And I would just quickly tack on to that these the little sort of striations across it are very reminiscent of the oldest form of haspe pattern, which is called tachones.
This
and
one?
Tachones, yes, but in the one you were just showing as well.
Oh, yes.
That is, whether that's actually been dyed with haspe or not, that sort of very short rectangular couple of threads with a contrasting color is the earliest known way of doing that from these communities. That goes back to the late 19th century.
We do
So
have
1800s.
This Ruja Hualcha, it's associated with a spirit that lives that inhabits the Lake Atitlan, but part of his artwork is connected to the lake, to the water, and this is just a representation of the way the community lives there. Something that is interesting is how they are working sometimes with their own women or with women from the community on creating with their collaboration, that it's part of the ancient way of living, on creating this type of contemporary arts, because they live in two different systems. One is the community, indigenous community that has its own system, but they are capable of going and insert themselves into the contemporary art scenario, international scenario. I don't know if regarding this piece, because this is Manuel Chavajay, another one, do you have any comment of this? This has been done with oil, born oil from the motors on the lake, on the lake. But of course, it's the embroidered. And it's interesting that they are learning to embroider themselves, but they learn from the mothers or from the wives or basically from the women of community.
Well, for me, it's interesting because, again, limited frame of reference, but the traditional women's garment in Mayan communities, the huipil, if you open up a huipil and you look, there's a center where your neck would go through, and that's always embroidered around that. Sometimes there's also other patterns, other techniques that are going on in there, but there's a lot of embroidery. So when I see that circle, and then especially the previous painting with the hole in the sunlight, that's it. I see a bit of a reference to traditional garments in there as well.
And it's
Yes, thank you, Alina.
okay. And this one, finally, we are closing with shock. That is not because Pichilla and Manuel Chavajay belongs to the Tzotzil community, the Maya Tzotzil community, but the shock is more from descendant Quechua and Cachiquel. And I think it is, he's more thinking more on the formal challenges of a piece, even though he's aware that in the selections of colors, he uses in part the primary colors because of the meaning on the Mayan community, but he also uses green and another combinations, but mostly he uses primary colors. But and also he's like making an investigation, a research with the line, and of course the line, the thread is a line, that departing from the line and creating this type of, I would say, installations that includes the act of the formal idea of the weaving, but in another way, in an expanded way, he goes to a sculpture. And my last question, we do have a minute, but we can extend like 5 minutes more for the questions, because we have 5 minutes for those who can remain here with us. Is that the importance of how these contemporary indigenous artists are also allowed to go from their roots to any other place without, I mean, just like bringing her ancient inheritance, but also taking or doing what Osvaldo de Andrade recommends in the 1930s, the cannibalism, the anthropophagia cultural, because it is not only the European men who can practice this type of taking or doing appropriations, but they can also go and take whatever they need from Europe and bring it into their contemporary artworks. That's my vision, but I would like to know what do you think, Carol and Shery.
I think that was so basic to threading the city, that if there was a message, one message that comes through, it's just that these are so many of the artists look to the past and respect the past. I think a lot of this has to do with respect for the past, not just to appropriate it, but to do it in a very respectful manner, and also to pay homage to the cultures that inform their work, and to go amongst, to do workshops and go amongst the people that are doing this, especially the women. It's become very important that the number of cooperatives and collectives and groups that are forming in these countries to save the traditions.
Yeah, I would to echo that, and I think for me also being mindful of the significance of, especially there again, Andean, is the significance that's attached to every step. Everything has, and not just one meaning, but multiple meanings, and they can change from community to community. There is, of course, similarity, but just to be mindful of that there's nothing that's extraneous. There's nothing that isn't layered in different ways, and sometimes it's not always what we would maybe think of as ritual or something that has a spiritual dimension. It's also things that structure their relationships to each other within their kin groups, with the natural environment in terms of when it's time to plant, this is how we record it in this textile and things like that. So that's, to me, that mindfulness is really important.
Thank you, Shery. So I want to, who wants to make formulate a question, do a comment? Alina, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes. That you are looking at the chat? Does someone has a question?
We have no questions yet. If anybody wants to ask anything, we can open up the mic. Otherwise, you can conclude if you like.
Okay, no questions. Thank you so much.
I have a question, Alina. It's Shelley McCoy.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi. Hi, Carol. Hi, everyone. Listen, I have a question. Hi. What is the size of this the piece we're looking at right now, the scale?
This one that is on the relief section?
Yes.
Yes. How important is your question? There is something very important about him, is that he works a lot with mathematics. Do you know that Mayans are really good astronomers and mathematicians? They discovered this field, and he works with the area proportions. So I think this, I have the dimensions, but I think it's, just give me a second because I do have it. So,
okay.
But I know that he plays trying to get the 1.67 in the proportions. I think it's like, okay, wait. I don't know why I'm not being able to go. Okay. For some reason, I'm trying to go into the file, but I cannot open it.
There you go.
Oh, yes, I have it here. No, I think it's because in centimeters, I do believe it's 150 by 100, but by 100, and the profundity is around 37.
Sí, son 59 por 39 inches. 59, disculpen que interrumpa. 59 inches de altura por 39 aproximado de ancho. Inches.
Yes.
Es una pieza en el piso.
Yes, it's 59 by 39.
59 by 39.
By 39. Yes.
59 by 39 inches.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
I was just asking the size because it's, yeah. No, I was asking the scale because I know that that's important in this body of work, but it also reminds me of Carl Andre, the minimalist sculptures.
Yes.
And I find it very interesting that he went from the weaving,
yes,
from the fiber pieces
to
this. I find it actually I find it fascinating.
Precisely, and this is the very first time he will have the opportunity. He had been having many exhibitions, but he never had on display the entire process from the line through the sculpture. So what we are going to put on display on Tanya Brillenburg Art precisely is that it's going to be a section that departs from a drawing with graffito and finish on the sculpture, but then you will see the thread and the line being transformed, and sometimes how he plays with the line, making wider or then giving volume to the line, but it's originally is a thread. but then
Very interesting.
also into this. So thank you, because the question is very, very important. And you are invited to go to the inauguration on November 29, and we will have also a talk on December 10.
Okay. Thank you for sure.
You're welcome. Any other question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all, to the three of you. And I have a question on Manuel Chavajai's work, in which I see a lot of circles. So what can you talk or tell us about the symbolism of the circle in pre-Hispanic iconography? In like the slides before this one, if you've seen Manuel Chavajai's work, there were like 2 circles.
Las fotografías del lago Atitlán, the embroidered photographs of Lago Atitlán, Adriana.
Yes, no, she's asking about the symbolism of circle, but I was remembering Shirley is going to, there is a little danger of making general conclusions of this is exactly this, because it depends on the context and on the culture but I will, what she said is she connect this with the repeal. Actually, this what I am wearing is from the Atitlan community, and it's a transformed repeal. Cheryl, I let you.
Well, and that's also, I would say, more of a technical or a practical or sort of looking at my knowledge of the traditional clothing and things from the region, saying, oh, that's kind of an interesting connection. I don't know that that's probably the connection that an artist is trying to make. And unfortunately, I really don't know much, or certainly not near enough, about Mayan either cosmology or other areas that would, the symbolism of the circle would be something that I could comment on, unfortunately.
But what I want to say is that the Mayans were the creators of the idea of the circular time. They had 2 calendars that were always going and coming. The 2 calendars were the half that has the duration of 260 days. That is the time of pregnancy, and also a lunar calendar. And they have the Solkin that is 360 days plus 5 and a special period that is the Wayeb. So these 365 days, remember, they were really great astronomers, one of the best astronomers of antiquity, and they were able to calculate the time that a planet like Venus took to go around the sun. So the circle, it's also the repetition of time, the repetition and renovation of life. And of course, they had also a particular mathematic to make these wheels connect the solar and the lunar. But for me, it has been always very interesting to find out that, for example, Jorge Luis Borges, the writer, the Argentinian writer, writes about the circularity of time, that the things will, what it was will become again. And if you think about, this is the basis of agriculture. When the as Leroy Gourhan, the archaeologist, says, when men was able to domesticate the time, then he began to domesticate everything, the cycles of the plants, the day and the night, etc. But in the Mayans, the idea of the calendars and the repetition of time and the charge of time, that each time has a particular charge that will take, and this is astronomical, 52 years, for example, takes for going back to complete the entire circle in the life of each person. So there are a lot of many symbolism connected to, I would say, a philosophical comprehension of time in the universe.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here, sharing this special, and thanks a lot to Carol and to Shery. Thank you so much. I am honored of having you, and of course to FAMA, organizers of Threading the City, and to Florida National Endowment for the Arts that has supported this series of public lectures.